Hand of the Day.
Hey guys, it's Alex Torelli, and welcome back to another episode of the Hand of the Day. Excited to bring you this one. It's from Hello Alec number 95, my reader Firo. Really loyal fan, and appreciate all your comments and everything. Awesome hand, really interesting, and a lot of cool comments in this one too. So a quick shout out to StillTrying2Help, who really takes a game theory approach to the hand. If you read the comments on the Hello Alec channel, there's a great discussion there, over 80 comments on this one. He advocates raising in this hand, and he says that it's better to do raising on the flop because it's more of a game theory approach. I mean, if you're going to raise all your draws here on a flop like this one, and you don't raise your sets, your hands for value, then your range will be too unbalanced. So every time you're raising, it's going to be too obvious that you have a draw. Contrast that with what Bob Georgiou says. It's just a more practical approach. He says, look, you're playing micro stakes, you're not playing against world-class players, and even if you are, there's a lot of draws out there. You should just pound, and bet big on the turn, raise the flop, get the money in there, and just punish the draws. They both kind of come to the same conclusion, but they do it from different places. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that a lot of different approaches, even conflicting approaches, could come to the same answer, as in this case, or different answers. And there's just so much to be said about how the nuances of poker and the different players you're playing against, the different context, the different situation, all influence and change, ultimately, how you play a hand. So without further ado, let's get to the hand of the day. So we're playing some microstakes online poker here, and we are early position. We make it 30 cents, 5 cent, 10 cent with 2 queens. And the guy to our left, who we describe as a complete unknown, 3 bets to $1.15. Now both the small blind and the big blind call cold, which is not something that you see often, or maybe in live poker occasionally if they're really loose players and the stacks are deep, but it's just not something that you see generally in the mid and higher stakes. So in this spot, I'd be kind of inclined to 4-bet, just because I feel like when people call cold at small stakes and they are the type of player that's willing to gamble a lot pre-flop, they're going to gamble pretty much regardless. So if you were to make it here, let's say $3, I think if someone calls $1.15 out of position, they're going to call $3 as well, and you could get a large amount of money in pre-flop in position against very weak players in the blinds. Now, of course, you made a good point, Firo, that you do have to be worried about the re-raiser in this position, but if he applies a lot more pressure on you and he shoves and 5-bets all in, I think chances are that with 2 other players still in the pot, if he's 5-betting cold there, you could probably let your 2 queens go, because I think he's up, you're up against kings or aces a lot of the time, unless this guy's just complete spaz or something. But I would probably 4-bet there and take control of the hand. Calling is fine too. You keep the other bad players in the pot and you don't force yourself out of the pot. So I mean, both have merit. I would mix it up, but I'd probably lean towards 4-betting a little more of the time. Anyway, we decide to call, and we go 4 ways to the flop. To the flop.
The flop comes with Queen, Jack of Hearts, and 6 of Clubs.
Flop comes Queen, Jack, 6. Of course, gin for us. We flop the nuts, but there is a big flush draw out there, and it's important to note that both the Queen and the Jack are hearts, and that'll come into play a little later in the hand. But it dramatically reduces the amount of flush draw combos that our opponents can have, because of course they can't have a Queen high or a Jack high flush draw. So the big blind bets out in this pot, and we're in a spot where of course raising is fine, calling is fine, we just can't fold, we have the nuts. It's almost like, what do we do with deer in headlights? It's so hard to flop the nuts, and now you're in a spot where you have to figure out how to play the hand the best way possible. So ultimately, I would mix it up here. I like what Bob Georgiou said. I like what StillTrying2Help said. I'm going to echo StillTrying2Help's comments here and elaborate a bit. If you are the type of player that's going to be raising 100% of your draws here on the flop, you have to add in a set of queens, a set of jacks, a set of 6s here, and queen jack into your raising range for value. Otherwise, every time you raise, you're just going to have too many draws in your range, and you're never going to have hands for value. It's going to be too easy for your opponents to play against you. If, on the other hand, you're never raising this flop, some players I know don't have a raising range here. They just call their entire range. They're going to be calling with a queen, a single pair of queens, not a set, and they're going to be calling with their draws and their sets and two pairs. If that's you, if you're going to be calling your entire range, then go ahead and call with this as well. So I would mix it up here. I would probably lean towards calling because I know that the guy behind me is in the pot, the small blind. I give him a chance to stay in the pot. I like to balance my range that way and trap people. I also like to call with a lot of draws here and maybe keep the pot smaller and find other ways to win the pot later in the hand. I would call personally with my playing style, but whatever you guys normally do, just make sure your range is balanced here. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Anyway, we decided to call, and the original raiser calls. We go 3 ways to the turn. Now, the turn comes complete offsuit 3, so we still have the nuts, great spot. The big blind checks. When he checks here, I'm pretty much putting him on air most of the time. I think it takes a really creative player to check here with, let's say, a set, hoping to check raise and get all the money in here. I think if they're too scared that there's too many draws and it's going to go check check, I think they would most likely think that if someone else had something, they would have raised the flop, and so they probably are going to continue leading the hand, building the pot. So when he checks here, I expect it to be a check fold almost all of the time. So you're in a spot where you pretty much have to bet. I mean, your only consideration for checking would be if you were sure that the guy to your left was going to bet. Maybe you got a live read if you're playing live poker. I know this hand is online. If you're playing live poker and you get a live read, or you're just very sure about your villain, you know he's going to bet his entire range, maybe you could check, hope to trap the small blind, and then check raise all in. That's getting a little fancy. I think that with 3 people in the pot and 4 cards against you, with so many draws out there, either cards that could improve to beat your hand or cards that kill your action, I think betting is the best play. You went ahead and bet about $4 here, which is pretty damn small. Yes, you leave yourself a little bit of room to shove the river, and you give your opponent 2-to-1 odds on the river to call you, which I like that you were thinking ahead, Firo. But I think that more of the time, I'm going to agree with Bob Georgiou here. The pot's pretty decent size already. You want to punish draws. You don't want a bad river card to come and kill your action. And if your opponent has a made hand, he's going to call. I don't think it's really likely that he's going to somehow be in the pot on the flop with a made hand that can't call a bet on the turn. So if your opponent had something like what you thought he had, let's say like a pair of jacks that he's not really willing to stack off with, I think he's going to fold that on the flop in a 4-way pot after it goes bet call. I don't think he's in there with something like king jack. So I think when he's in there on the flop as the re-raiser, he either has a massive draw or he has an overpair or a set himself or something like that. And I think those hands are going to continue. If he has something even like king queen, he's not going to fold it on the turn. So I would bet bigger and just punish the draws and just commit myself to the pot. Even shoving here could be fine if you really think your opponent's going to think that you have a draw when you shove. I think it looks kind of weak, and your opponent might pay you off here. So I would bet a lot bigger. Anyway, we have to play the hand as it is. We decided to bet $4, and our opponent calls. The river comes a king of hearts, which is a brutal card for us. You said it was a great card for our hand because you thought that it would make your opponent possibly improve to something like 2-pair where he could call you, or something like that. I just don't really see that. I don't think there's any 2-pair combinations your opponent has except king queen, and there's only one combination of that. So I just, if he has king queen suited, I just don't really see this river being good for us. Not only could it have improved our opponent's hand to something better than ours if he had a flush draw, or a set of kings or something, but it's so unlikely that we're bluffing now that all of the hands that were worse than ours are going to be very difficult to get value from. It's very hard to get value from something like ace queen or aces in a spot like this, which comprise a big part of our opponent's range, that we could get paid off, because he's just going to think that we have it every time we shove here. So I think he's probably going to fold aces, he's probably going to fold ace queen, and the only hands he's really going to call us with here are sets, flushes, straights, and maybe 2 pairs as well. So against that range, we're not doing great. I mean, there's not that many hands that pay us off, but the pot is so big, so I would probably shove it in here against a completely unknown player most of the time. But a spot like this on the river could really depend a lot on what you know about your opponents, and I saw a lot of different comments here about what to do on the river. Against really tight, straightforward ABC opponents, there's a lot of players like this, in live poker especially. They're never going to get tricky, they're never going to get out of line, they're always going to play their hand for value ABC. Against those types of players, you could even consider check folding. I mean, I know it's extreme, but they're simply never going to shove a worse hand, and they're probably never going to call with a worse hand either. The only worst hand they might call you with is a set of jacks or something like that. But against those players, if they're really ABC straightforward, they would have raised the flop or the turn with a set of jacks. So you know that their range is so narrow, so condensed, and they're going to play so straightforward that you simply could almost argue for a check fold. Against certain types of players, you could even argue for a check call. It's an extreme line as well. It's something that's different. expecting someone to turn a hand into a bluff. There's just not that many hands that people could have to turn into a bluff, and there's not that many times they're going to shove worse. So it's like a very, very small range of players that you would check call for value with in this spot. Most players are simply going to check behind anytime they have a worse hand, and they're going to bet all their better hands. There's only a very, very narrow range of players that you could check call with for value, expecting them to shove worse. And there's not that many types of players that are going to call you with a worse hand. But most of the time, I think that in this spot, you're a favorite to have the best hand on the river, and because you only have half-size pot bet left, you're probably going to check call it off anyway and not love it. I would just shove and hope that my opponent makes a bad call with something worse than mine, like 2 aces or something like that. But I think a lot of this gives credence to betting bigger on the turn, because it's just a spot where, you know, it's really, really hard to play against, especially if you're deeper stacked. I think it becomes much more important as well. But that's it for the hand of the day. Hope you took something from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy. Cheers. You just got crushed.
I don't mind too much about the bad beat, but rather about the line and the fact that maybe I didn't play it optimally.